If you are anything like me and you follow current trends in the comic book industry and or you follow monthly sales of comic books on Diamond Comics' website, you are likely thinking the same thing that I've been thinking. Are comic books going extinct? We'll find out today. Hey, all my comic book aficionados, Dante D here, and welcome to the channel where we talk about comic books and other geek stuff. A little while ago, I posted a video commemorating Stan Lee back when he passed away, and in that video, I mentioned something about comic books not really being cared about as much as they were in the past. And a longtime subscriber to the channel named Louie from Studio Fitness, hey Louie, shout out to you, mentioned that he felt the same way, that comic books are kind of becoming a little bit like vinyl, that only hardcore fans are actually following comic books, what's going on in comic books, and reading them. So are they proverbially going the way of the dinosaur? I've been reading about this online a lot lately, and there are a lot of articles online that are providing conflicting information. Some are saying that comic book sales are actually improving, and others are saying that they are just completely in decline. And I have to say, I have found more articles stating the latter, that they are in decline. When you compare the present day sales figures of comic books to sales figures even say 40, 50 years ago, you're going to see a stark difference. And that is why I personally think that comic book sales are actually in decline. And I also believe that comic book sales will likely never recover. But does that mean that comic books are going extinct? Well, that's what I kind of want to talk about today. I wanted to discuss the reasons why I think that comic book sales will never recover, and ultimately answer the question, are comic books going extinct? So if you go online, there's a website called Comic-Con, which will give you the estimated sales figures of comic books per year. And if you see, let's look at December 2018, for example. The best-selling comic book of December 2018 was The Batman Who Laughs, which sold an estimated 220,000 units. We can attribute the great sales of The Batman Who Laughs to the fact that this is a new, hyped about, talked about comic book, and that is why it sells so many copies. That usually happens with comic books nowadays, is that they're really hyped about, and as soon as they're released, people flock to go and buy copies of it. But on average, a monthly title that sells well can only really expect to sell about 90,000 to 100,000 copies per month. If you go back to the 1960s, let's say 1969, you can see that the monthly sales of comic books were quite a bit larger. So like take this Superman comic here, sold 500,000 copies a month, roughly. And this was very common back then. If you even go back to the 1940s and 1930s, those numbers will be even larger. There isn't a lot of data on individual comic sales from the 1930s and 1940s, but it is estimated that millions of copies of comic books were sold per month. Heck, you can go back even less time to say 1991 and see that comic books were even selling better there. Now, mind you, the 90s, we were in the middle of a speculator's bubble in comic books, and that is the reason why there were so many comic book sales. But overall, you can see that people don't buy comic books as much as they did, say, even 30 years ago. Now, there are many contributing factors to why people don't buy comic books as much as they did in the past. But I think the number one reason for that would be that the comic book medium is likely a little dated. Now, I am not hating on comic books. Gosh, this whole channel is about comic books. I love comic books and will be reading them until my dying day. But I have no problems admitting that the comic book medium is a little bit dated. Nowadays, people read particular material differently, and they also have other things that they like to do with their spare time. Let's go back to the 1940s, for example. Comic books sold very well in the 1940s. But I really think that the reason why they sold so well is because a lot of the distractions that are available today didn't exist back then. Let's think about it. Back in the 1940s, most people didn't have a TV. TV was a new type of technology that was just emerging. People didn't have Facebook, they didn't have internet, they didn't have smartphones, they didn't have video games. So really, what was there to do with your time besides listening to radio shows or reading? It's really interesting to see that the sales of comic books decline as new technologies begin to emerge. Let's take the 1960s, for example. Now, generally, this is considered a great era for comic books. This was the height of the Silver Age and the Marvel Age of comics. However, if you look at the sales of comic books in the 1960s, they are a far cry from what they were in the 1930s and 1940s. That we can attribute to the fact that there was just a lot more to do with your spare time. By the 1960s, most Americans had a television in the house and people were spending more time watching TV or going to the movies. This trend continues into the 1980s. What happened in the 1980s? Video games start to emerge and people now have TV, they have video games, and they have other things to distract them from reading comic books. Now again, comic books were quite popular in the 1980s, and by the 1990s they became extremely popular, but I think the explosion in comic book sales in the 1990s was really artificial and was not a good representation of who was actually reading comic books, because again, as we all know, the 1990s was the era of comic book speculation, where people were buying comic books as an investment, thinking that they were going to get rich off of these books. Fast forward to today, where a previously hot title like Batman is only selling a meager 90,000 copies per month. And in this day and age, as you all know, we have distractions galore. Smartphones, we have social media, we have really awesome video games, we have awesome TV, movies. The technology that is available today to entertain us is really unprecedented and is very important to consider when we're pondering why people are not buying comic books as much as they did in the past. Speaking of technology, the other thing that we have to consider is digital reading. Nowadays, we have access to Kindle readers and reading apps on our tablets and on our phones, and this is leading people to just skip print altogether. Another factor that I feel is contributing to the decline in sales of comic books is the price of comic books. A comic book nowadays costs what? $3.99, some of them $4.99, some of them even $5.99. And when you're considering what you're getting in this book, usually most often a 32-page story with ads in the middle, is it really worth your money? Comic books in the 1930s and 1940s and not even 1950s were 10 cents. And yes, we have inflation to consider. And yeah, 10 cents was a lot of money for a kid or a person wanting to buy comic books back then. But was it really? Because I mean, comic books sold very, very well back then. And I think people really could spare a dime to read an adventure of their favorite superhero. And you have to consider that back then, a dime got you a lot of story. Comic books were more anthology books back in the 1930s and 40s, and you were getting so many different stories. So let's look at Action Comics #1. That was not all Superman. So you had a Superman story, and then you had a Zatara story, and then you had all these different stories, and these books were really, they were quite thick. They were a lot thicker than comic books nowadays, so you were getting a lot of bang for your buck. Nowadays, you pay $3.99 for a book, and you get 32 pages, and you're done reading it pretty much in 15 minutes. Is it really worth it? And obviously, I'm biased on this issue because the price of comic books is one of the reasons why I stopped buying new comic books. I haven't purchased a brand new comic book in probably 2 years now, because I just didn't feel that it was worth my money. Now, I still collect back issues, and I'm always on the hunt for issues from the 1970s, 1980s, and even the 1960s, but the 1960s books have gotten quite expensive. Heck, even the 70s and 80s books have too, but anyway, that's besides the point. Let's now talk about the elephants in the room, and those being the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Cinematic Universe. And you're probably thinking, why am I mentioning those? I actually feel that these superhero blockbusters are taking away from comic book sales. Nowadays is the era of superhero fans that have never even read a comic book. I cannot tell you how many people I have met that absolutely love Thor. They claim to be these huge Thor fans, and they've never read a comic book in their life. Never even looked at one. Which I don't think is huge. I don't want to make comic book fandom and superhero fandom a pretentious thing, saying that you're not a real fan because you don't read comic books. That's not it. Anyone who likes whatever that just makes them a fan automatically. But it is important to consider that these people became fans through the superhero films, not necessarily the superhero comic books like people did 40, 50 years ago. Now, I'm not saying that I hate superhero blockbuster films. I actually love them. I go and see them, all the ones I want to see anyway. And I actually thank superhero blockbuster films because in a way, I kind of feel like they have made geek culture a little bit more acceptable. Back in the day, I could never go out with an Amazing Spider-Man t-shirt because I would get made fun of. People would think I was a dork or immature. But nowadays, I go around wearing these types of t-shirts all the time, and people are like, oh, Spider-Man, huh? That's pretty cool. So at the end of the day, superhero blockbuster movies, I think, are good for geek culture, but bad for comic book sales. But we know this was not always the case. Back when the 1989 Batman was released, there was a huge surge in comic book sales. But I think that was due in part to all the news reports that were going around about all of these old comic books selling for big money, and those were around the time that the Batman 1989 film came out. So I think they kind of went hand in hand a little bit. I think the Batman 1989 just kind of really embellished the whole comic book craze a little bit more. This certainly is not the case today because overall as a society, I think we've learned you're not going to get rich off of comic books. The last thing I want to talk about with respect to the declining sales of comic books is something I just want to touch upon briefly, and that is the content of the comic books, specifically social justice warrior rhetoric. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I feel that we need to dedicate a whole entire video to diversity in comics and social justice warrior rhetoric in comics. But overall, I would say that fans are not responding well to diverse superheroes. Would you agree? And I think it's really funny that I'm mentioning this right now because many times on this channel, people have called me a social justice warrior for some views that I have shared. But overall, I would not really consider myself a social justice warrior. I don't think being progressive or just believing in common courtesy and respect makes you a social justice warrior. I actually, believe it or not, don't really like this new social justice warrior agenda that Marvel has had, and even that DC has dabbled in a little bit. But I honestly think that Marvel is the more guilty of the two companies. And I really think that is because Marvel has always been the more progressive company of the two. Back in the 70s, back in the 80s, I found that Marvel's attention to diversity was very tasteful. Nowadays, I feel that it is very much in your face. I have talked to so many fans who have just given up reading brand new comic books for this reason. They've just told me, I am tired of the social justice warrior BS that Marvel and DC are dabbling in, and I'm just done with it. This has actually also gotten the attention of the media. There have been news reports that have blamed social justice warrior content for declining sales in comic books. Now, I think it's a little bit more complicated than just saying it's all of this leftist rhetoric that is ruining the comic book industry. Like I said, much more complex than that. I think this is definitely something we need to take into consideration though, because if you take into consideration the demographic of comic book readers, you'll find that they are predominantly white males. But I think as a whole, people who are reading comic books, not to say that they're bigots, but they just really don't care about that kind of stuff and don't want to be reading about that kind of stuff. Heck, I've even had some discussions with some of my Latino viewers who don't even like this agenda that Marvel has fostered. They were even telling me, like, heck, I'm Latino, I don't even like Miles Morales. I just think that what they're doing is totally BS. But like I said, definitely a discussion for another video, but I would love to hear your thoughts on social justice warrior Marvel or DC. Nevertheless, let me know in the comments. What do you think? Do you like that direction that they're taking, or do you absolutely despise it? So let's answer the question. Are comic books going extinct? I personally think no, actually. Yes, comic book sales may be declining. I really don't think comic books are going anywhere. They're always going to be there, and there's always going to be a fan base for this medium. But that's just my opinion. What do you all think? Do you think comic books are going extinct? Do you think that even 20, 30, 40 years from now that comic books will cease print entirely? Let me know in the comments. So that about does it for our video today. I really hope that you enjoyed it. And I'd really like to hear your thoughts on the matter. Do you feel that there are any other factors that I did not discuss today that are contributing to declining sales in comic books? Please let me know in the comments. And as always, if you liked this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. And check out the channel for other great videos on topics related to geek culture. Until next time, this is Dante D signing off. I will see you all in the next episode.